Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Azim Khan, a story scholar with 1947 Partition Archive, and it is my pleasure to be your host today. Welcome to the 75 Days of Partition series. This is day 67 of hosting esteemed guests for this series, which will continue till August 17th. Today, we will be speaking to Dr. Ankur Datta. Dr. Datta teaches at the Department of Sociology in South Asian University, New Delhi. His work addresses themes of displacement and victimhood and is interested in themes such as the history and memory of violence. He has published articles in journals such as History and Anthropology, Modern Asian Studies, and Contributions to Indian Sociology. He is the author of On Uncertain Ground, Displaced Kashmiri Pundits in Jammu and Kashmir, published by the Oxford University Press in 2017. Welcome, Ankur, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's jump straight in to the questions. How did your interest in partition start? Was it academic or personal?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. So let me put it this way. So, as an academic, I've always been interested in exploring experiences of violence, displacement, and the larger question of victimhood. So, as a student of social anthropology and working at a sociology department, I am situated fundamentally with scholars who are looking fundamentally at the contemporary. But it is from this kind of work, looking at the contemporary, that I also found it important now to sort of keep sort of one eye on events that took place in the past. In terms of, so I have an academic interest, but now in terms of a personal interest, well, I mean, I could say yes, I have a personal connection in the sense I'm what one may call a Bangal. Bangal, as in my family on both sides, from my mother's side and my father's side, uh, locate their origins in East Bengal, which became East Pakistan and later, now currently Bangladesh. And so my mother's side of the family situates itself around Dhaka as an origin. My father's from Shanhati and Khulna. And through my grandparents, also other areas like Joshua, etc., come into play. Now, some of my interest in themes of displacement and violence, I did emerge from stories that I'd heard. Um, though my both sides of my family again were anyway had connections across both sides of the border, so to speak. So let's say my paternal grandfather was already working as a doctor in Chhattisgarh in the early 1940s, and similarly my maternal grandparents were already involved with economic life in Assam. So you were looking at people who were going back and forth um, across what became then solidified borders. So I'll put it this way: they did not face the refugee life in that, which unfortunately befell a lot of people, but nevertheless they had kin who did, and they also were aware of the kinds of mass displacement that happen. I know my paternal grandfather would have witnessed sites like Mana Camp, which was a refugee camp that comes up much later. Uh, and again, sort of my mother's family with his connections to Assam, while relatively cushioned from the actual the kind of dispossession involved in the partition, also had to contend with the kind of ethnic politics that one saw in Assam from the 1950s onwards. And I mean, both sides of my family knew a lot of Bangals in terms of East Bengali Hindu refugees who were not so fortunate. So at one level, I have an academic interest that's there, but there was an interest that had already come up from whatever I would hear and see, and one felt some kind of connection. And but then again, as a student, I started reading some of the work that came up in the 90s and the early 2000s. So one of here is thinking of scholars like and writers like Urvashi Butalia, Veena Das, Gyanendra Pandey in their work. So I think it's a mix of both. But like I said, as a scholar, much of my work begins in the contemporary. And my doctoral work, which still kind of defines a lot of my interests and which is what I've published mostly from, was based on research in Jammu and Kashmir. So I was looking at the displacement of Kashmiri pundits, who are the Hindu minority of Jammu and Kashmir, and who were displaced from their homes in 1990. So I was working with the population in the context of what is an ongoing conflict in the Kashmir Valley. So while I was looking at a people, perhaps, and a situation that was like taking place well after the partition, even though one would see a lot of the conflict around Jammu and Kashmir as being seen as an unfinished agenda of the partition, but though that's a very limited way of looking at it, I found myself interestingly falling back on some kind of partition imaginary, especially when I was looking at the Kashmiri pundit. So I did fieldwork in a migrant camp colony. These were camp colonies that were set up in the city of Jammu for displaced Kashmiri pundits. And when I saw it, somehow I kept seeing traces of what I read and heard of refugee camps from 1947, especially in terms of camps that were closely related to urban areas where the camps become part of the city. So one sees this in places like in Calcutta, or where you have all this work done and all these stories of squatter colonies or refugees that became just part of the city. One hears of camps like in Delhi, which also had a similar relationship. And my field site, one of the camps I looked at in Jammu, also had that relationship with Jammu city as well. So in an interesting way, while I was looking at a different experience and a different population, there was something familiar about it. And even in policy, one began to see a kind of familiarity. So the people I worked with were called migrants, and that's the term used to refer officially to displaced people in Jammu and Kashmir. It was a state category. And while there's a lot of debate among a lot of people, like what is the meaningfulness of this category of the migrant, as scholars like Abhijit Dasgupta point out, this term was actually already existed. It was used to talk about refugees, I'm sure definitely in the Indian context. So it was a policy category tied to refuginess from 1947 itself. And when I started presenting papers based on this research as a graduate student, so these would be graduate seminars, right? I mean, with fellow students, anybody working in South Asia would say, well, this happened in 1947. What you're describing is there's nothing new. You know, you're just telling the same story. It's just a different site and a different time. And I found that interesting, that somehow I was, the partition forms a kind of imaginary framework with which we seem to understand other situations of displacement in South Asia. So my interest in partition and its aftermath kind of got rekindled because of that. And I felt that, hey, one should perhaps think a bit more about partition again. So that's kind of where it is. So it's a mix. It's a kind of interweaving of some personal interest, some sense of personal connection. And at the same time, there is an academic interest too. And I come around with it to the past through questions emerging from what one would say is contemporary.
And of course, experience. And what was the research about?
Sorry, I just missed the first part of the question.
So yeah, you did your grant research at the archive.
Yes.
How was your experience?
So the grant research at the archive was a very interesting one. So it was also something, for me, it was a bit of a shift in terms of approaching material. So I was trained as an ethnographer, as I mentioned. I came from social anthropology with this orientation to doing fieldwork. So this was my first engagement with an archive. But like I said, a lot of my interest came from the contemporary. So what I became intrigued about was, if the partition was forming a kind of imaginary, is there a way of thinking about the partition as a kind of originary moment on questions of violence and displacement we see in South Asia? So and whether it shapes how we see violence and displacement, definitely in India, and Pakistan, and maybe Bangladesh for that matter. So what I wanted to look at was to use the archive and the testimonies featured in the archive to see how people spoke about the event. Now, the partition of India with the end of colonialism is a critical event, as Veena Das would sort of point out, because it reworked ideas of belonging, community, and citizenship across the region, shaping how the past was imagined before 1947, how one imagined political life in the modern nation state after 1947 as well. It allowed the state to bring in formalized categories in how we deal with displaced people and popular imaginaries of refugees. But so I wanted to see if, given my sort of experience with contemporary work in terms of Jammu and Kashmir, and maybe even thinking about other kinds of conflicts that are happening in the region, whether the partition was that point in which our language, in which the language we employ and the conceptual categories that we employ in understanding violence and displacement in the region emerged. So I was interested in exploring the archive and to look at how people talked about those experiences. And so my project initially in the grant period was called Mapping the Language of Victimhood, Violence and Suffering in the 1947 Partition Archive. And the two guiding research questions were this: what is the language and vocabulary used by survivors of the partition and witnesses of the partition as well when they speak of experiences of violence and displacement? And the second part, of course, emerging from that is how does that vocabulary shape the testimony as well? So one of the things I was paying attention was to listen to the testimonies that were there, where I was hoping to track the use of certain words and categories that spoke to violence, suffering, displacement, victimhood, and home. And of course, this interest in the archive is part of a sort of larger interest I have in understanding modern victimhood in South Asia. So that is what I was interested in doing. And because I was paying attention to language, I ended up focusing mostly on East Bengal, right? On what became East Pakistan to some extent, because an archive is a vast place. There's just so much. There's just so much material that is already there. So at one level, I didn't want to be overwhelmed. So I thought, let me try and choose something methodologically which could be feasible. So if I focus on one region with much greater concentration, I might have a greater chance of navigating the material. I did look at some material from partition in the West, leading to, with the West Pakistan, and looking at some of the Punjabi stories, but that was more to get some balance. The other thing, of course, I speak Bangla as well. So I figured I would have a better grasp of the language that would come up if I focus on partition in the East. And I figured, well, I'm my grandparents were East Bengali Hindus, so let me try that. In the process of looking through the archive, it was really by chance. I encountered some testimonies from what was listed for Muslims in Bangladesh who were interviewed. And within that, I noticed the word camp is given as a location. And having done field work in a camp, I thought, this might be interesting. And that's how I encountered the question of the so-called Urdu-speaking Bihari, or people called Urdu-speaking or Bihari Muslims in Bangladesh. And so that's where that interest came up. So that's where that interest sort of came up. So I did look at two groups. I did look at the East Bengali Hindu refugees who left what became East Pakistan coming into different parts of India. But I also found the Bihari Muslim case to be actually quite fascinating as well. And what I was struck by was when I looked at the testimonies that were available, one saw a very interesting range. There was, of course, one testimony of a journalist, very educated, very interesting set of narratives. But what I was struck by was this very difficult position they faced. Because at one level, they faced one displacement in 1947, even though stories of travel are much more varied than what stereotypical counts made. One saw a population with an experience of displacement in 1947, ostensibly moving to a nation state they belonged to, and then in 1971, they lose citizenship and they're seen as sort of suspect. So in that sense, I became interested in this group. What I found very tragic also is that there's a kind of double displacement they face, where their sense of belonging to a place falls into question. In the sense they occupy an extremely complex location, which involved double displacement and where their citizenship was questioned. And it hits at the heart of the population. And what I also saw from the testimonies, what was interesting, what was coming out, was you were looking at a population that largely seemed to be consigned to the socioeconomic margins of Bangladesh from the testimonies. And I kept thinking about this. Some of the testimonies, they would often come across as, except for one person, the other testimonies featured men, one woman, there was one woman's narrative that also comes to mind, who were at first not forthcoming. It's not that they didn't want to talk. They weren't sure what they would say. they seemed in that sense a bit new to speaking about it. But as you hear these short testimonies come up, one starts to see a kind of reticence to speak, right? There was a kind of reticence, but within that, there's also a sense of continued discrimination. And at the same time, I started noticing certain words that would come up because of that experience of double displacement, and of people who ostensibly belonged to the nation state and all of a sudden lost that connection to the nation state, who were a kind of classic problem being caught neither here nor there. One saw a situation where you looked at life as a kind of question of saza, of tolerating saza, and how there was a need to claim some kind or an appeal to a larger population for insaniyat. And at the same time, some of the classic problems of identity, that as an Urdu-speaking person, who am I in the Bengal, what is ostensibly the Bengali nation state? And I found that raising very important questions, because at the end of the day, what partition appears to have done is that it raised the question of who belongs to the nation state in India and in Pakistan, and of course in Bangladesh, but also who does not. In that sense, partition wasn't simply just a fracturing of an area or just called building nation states and you choose where you want to go. It raises questions of who belongs to the nation and who does not. So who constitutes the people? So that was one aspect of it. The other sort of narratives I looked at were the Bengali Hindu narratives, which of course were very familiar in terms of the kind of things I would hear from older relatives or I would encounter in TV shows or novels or books. And within those, of course, is a slightly different story. One sees stories of departure, one sees stories of flight, the struggles of rebuilding life. And it was very familiar at one level, like I said, from stories and novels I'd read, but it's also very familiar because of the kind of narratives I encountered with my work on the Kashmiri pundits too. And of course, those accounts also have something very interesting because there's a mixing of this. So you have this event, right? It's, this massive political event. It involves all these. One way of looking at the partition is in terms of key players. Let's say one would think of a Mountbatten or a Nehru and a Jinnah and all these people and Radcliffe, and questions of statecraft and the state, drawing lines on a map. But within that, a lot of ordinary people who were affected saw their personal, had experiences that were also deeply personal to them. And how does one negotiate that larger question of the nation state, almost seemingly impersonal, one of detachment with these extremely personal stories? So even when one thinks about suffering, a lot of that suffering is tied to the community. It is tied to the nation state. In that sense, the modern South Asian nation state is born out of some kind of violence. But at the same time, there's these extremely personal stories, which may seem very mundane, but they cannot be ignored. So that's one thing that sort of comes up in the stories. Plus, it was great for me to learn. One of the best things about sometimes doing research is you just learn about something you never knew. I mean, I came across narratives like Geneva camp in Dhaka. I came across narratives of the Talbagicha camp in West Bengal. And again, a lot of this work on camps was very interesting, the testimonies, because it takes me back to my earlier work where I looked at displaced persons camp colonies. And when I look again at the two narratives together, I was looking for certain words like, which, I mean, when one starts research, one thinks what one is going to look for. So I was looking for mentions of, people mentioning words like grust, mazloom, khoti, and all these kind of terms that speak of, victimhood, violence, suffering. I didn't really encounter those. I do wonder if it's also because there is largely a very specific generation that is captured in the 1947 partition archive, in the sense people who were still relatively young during the time of the partition, maybe children or slightly older, but not fully mature people in that sense, at least across the narratives I had come across. But one sees this idea of life as being subject by punishment like saza. One sees the continued sort of feeling of dispossession or not being heard as and demanding justice for it. So insaf, that comes up in some of the narratives of the Bihari Muslims. Or this kind of pain and torture as uttachar or atyachar, or as again a kind of torture. So there are some of these languages that sort of come up, some of these terminologies. So I find that very interesting. I'm still come to terms with a lot of the material that is there to try and think through them as well, and to see what kind of lessons that can emerge from them in terms of how we can think about experiences of violence and displacement. But like I said, when one sees and reads about the question of life in a camp, stories of departure and flight, this idea of insaf or justice or attachar or onnai in Bangla, these are themes that still resonate a lot with contemporary life, and particularly people facing other kinds of violence and other kinds of conflict and forms of displacement that may not necessarily be tied to the partition, but they still resonate.
Yeah, I think it's very compelling, the way you're covering life in the camps and how identity and national identity is negotiated in the camps. Because even in Pakistan, the partition narrative, of course, comes from the center. The center tends to be more Punjabi centric, so we don't really get narratives of Baloch people and their association with the national identity of Pakistan and the national patriotic sense of being a Pakistani. Similarly to your work in Bihar, you've also done some very interesting work on the Kashmiri partition and particularly the Kashmiri pundits and their displacement. Would you please provide an overview of that, especially the feeling of anger and despair that you explore?
All right. So I did really look at the Kashmir partition that way. So when I look at the partition work, it's the Bihari Muslim narratives and the Bengali Hindu narratives. But I'll put it this way. So when I was doing my field work in Jammu among Kashmiri pundits, now the question of the conflict in Kashmir is incredibly complex because there's a mosaic of different populations who've been affected. Violence is caused by many different agents, and there are different populations who've been affected in different ways. What unites them is they're from this region and they've been affected by some kind of violence at the end of the day. And like I said, there is a way of looking at Jammu and Kashmir as a kind of unsettled agenda of the partition. Most of us begin with that, though it's a very partial view. There's a lot that happens between 1947 to 1990 as well, and that needs to be accounted for, though that's not my main focus. But my work with the Kashmiri pundits was interesting. It says I did meet people who remembered the partition in terms of the first war that took place between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, 1948. So that was one thing. But there was also this assertion that, well, things weren't as bad as what one saw in Bengal and Punjab. But then, of course, with 1990, one sees a larger conflict. Now, with the Kashmiri pundits, of course, they are like, and which is why I found it interesting to think why maybe I was also somewhat drawn to the Bihari Muslim narrative, was because the Kashmiri pundits are also an interesting population because they're often very difficult to think with. They sort of are caught between different forces. You see them as a population caught between the Indian state. You see them as caught between, let's say, the movement for Kashmiri nationalism, which the Tehreek in that sense as it's spoken of. So you're looking at a population that's caught in the middle of many strands, largely located within the Indian nation state, and many of them would identify with it, but they seem to be caught within all these competing strands of approaching nationalist politics vis-a-vis Kashmir, historically, going back to 1930s, and then, of course, after 1947 and so on. And the vast majority of the Kashmiri pundits I met, the vast majority of the Kashmiri pundits were displaced from their homes with the outbreak of the conflict as we see in Kashmir as it's ongoing. And they were the people I looked at. And it is one of the most drastic cases of internal displacement in South Asia. I mean, the vast majority of the population left, with very few Kashmiri pundits left in Kashmir. But like I said, I think one of the reasons why I became sort of interested in some groups like Bihari Muslims, and even, let's say, even the Bengali Hindus, was that they seem to resonate with what I encountered with the Kashmiri pundits. With the Bihari Muslim, because you're looking at a population that's caught between many different currents, political currents, and competing political currents of nationalism and violence. That's one. And at the same time, like I said, when, as I mentioned earlier, when I was doing research on the Kashmiri pundits, there was a familiarity that was kind of, in terms of the narrative of life in the camp, departure, flight, being dispossessed, leaving everything behind. which reminded me of stories I had heard of Bengali Hindus, at least in terms of Bengali Hindu narratives that would come up, or any refugee narrative for that matter from the partition. So one saw very interesting resonances, points of familiarity. Hopefully, those points of familiarity would lead to points of empathy. But like I said, their story is also quite complex, because how does one talk about the Kashmiri Pandits without necessarily denigrating every other narrative in Jammu and Kashmir as well? Like without denigrating the narrative of the Kashmiri Muslims who are also caught in tremendous who are also caught in who also now have who have a history of, and memory of violence that they've faced that is also their own. So how does one talk about these different histories without putting to talk up let me just rephrase this. The challenge of thinking about memory is to be able to talk about someone's narrative, to see points of familiarity, empathy, sympathy, and understanding, and also to help us think analytically about these experiences without putting them in a zero-sum game, without putting them in competition. And a lot of South Asian politics, and I'm more familiar, of course, with India, but my sense with other South Asian countries is that we tend to pit the history and memory of different communities against each other, right? And it's worked very effectively in terms of communal and interreligious politics in South Asia. Partition itself becomes the example of the Hindu versus the Muslim versus the Sikh. How does one think about experiences of violence of very ordinary people and experience of displacement, where we see connections, we see points of empathy and sympathy and familiarity? So that's one thing which I remain interested in. But like I said, to some extent also this work with the archive was a way of also looking at newer material. Much of my work on the Kashmiri Pandits has been published, even though it is something I remain interested in, because it's something that's ongoing in the present. And as I said, there were people I met who had known of the partition, who did know of the language of the partition, though it wasn't the only language. And I'll come to that in a little bit, which is actually very interesting. And there were points of departure, like points of connection, right? Like when one thinks about, the experience of forced migration, the experience of displacement, life in a camp. And I think this is something where, of course, the most obvious connection point between, let's say, the Kashmiri Pandit experience, but there's also Kabir Robinson's work on Kashmiri Muslim refugees on across in Pakistani administered areas comes up in that case as well. There's something very similar to stories we hear from the partition. So in that sense, the partition still exists in framing how we view something like a camp, right? It frames how we look at something like a camp. So I do wonder then at the end of the day that despite, no matter how, even if we're in 2022, right? And this is sort of work I had begun in 2005. So that's about, 17 years ago. When I was much younger then. And this work I had been involved with for quite some time until recently. We still seem to fall back on the partition as the source of how we think about gross violence and displacement in our part of the world, regardless. And I think that is something still important to think about. It is not the only point of departure. In my experience with the Kashmiri Pandits, there was often a lot of Kashmiri Pandits would see connections with other histories, such as like the Holocaust of European Jews when they talk about the camp. Though the death camp in the context of, the Holocaust of European Jews is very different from what we saw with the partition refugee camp. No matter how terrible conditions were, these were relief camps. So we're not, they weren't extermination camps. But even that notion of being, denied justice, of, an uncertainty about the future persists. And at the same time, even in the partition, I think even in the 50s, people were still looking for a way to think about the partition. First of all, the partition of India in that sense was not the first example of the exchange of populations in the 20th century. I mean, there was an exchange of population between Turkey and Greece after the First World War, if I'm not mistaken, which followed very similar lines. It's almost like, that served as a model for what would come in our part of the world in 1947. But I'm also thinking of, like, there's this Bengali playwright called Sholil Shen, who wrote a play called The Notun Ihudi, or The New Jew, where he's writing about, for example, Bengali Hindu refugees. but it could apply to any other refugees. But for him, the archetype model was, the displaced Jew. So I think there is a lot of cross-pollination across movement already. Even during that time in the early days, just in the aftermath of the partition, people were still looking for that language, and one which is not necessarily reflected in the state, as you had mentioned, a centrist approach to partition narratives. That is inevitable when you're in the nation state. That is kind of inevitable. What you see, you'll see it in Pakistan, you'll see it in India, in Bangladesh, of course, with 1971. There is a somewhat different approach to the partition, because it is with 71 that you have, let's say, Bangladesh, the Bengali nation state in that sense. But like I said, maybe the way forward is to try and have a kind of multi-directional reading of memory. And when I mean multi-directional, here I'm drawing on Michael Rothberg's work, which I think is absolutely fantastic, where one sees memory as involving negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing, and one that's a kind of dialogic phenomena, and one that also complicates relation between memory and group identity, which overcomes the kind of statist view where your memory is definitive of your group identity. Rather, it is to help us think more clearly about who we are and who we can be, and what kinds of belonging we can imagine, and what kinds of inclusion we can also consider vis-a-vis in our relations with people we may deem as others. These questions remain important, because we are still, how we locate our sense of being, citizenship and belonging in modern India. I can say this from modern India, but I suspect maybe it's the same thing with contemporary modern Pakistan and Bangladesh and any other South Asian state, is something, we're still thinking with a lot of the questions that about belonging and citizenship, even though there are newer political challenges now, with what happened around this time 75 years ago. So yeah.
Sorry, I would like finally to illuminate one of these vignettes you include in your work on the Kashmiri pundits, and it's about Dr. Kaul and how he is pretty much restricted by the government of India, because of his status as a migrant, as a doctor, even as where he can go, where he can work. He's very limited, and it's because of the government. But his anger is almost exclusively on the Muslims.
Right.
And you mentioned how he thinks the earthquake was a result of the Muslims' actions, and you also talk about the protesters. So could you please illuminate us about this very fascinating bit of cognitive dissonance?
Right. Like I said, one of the problems with the Kashmiri Pandit, the displacement of the Kashmiri Pandits, many of them speak of this as an exodus. There's sort of two theories. One is that one theory is that they were targeted for being ostensibly Hindu and ostensibly supporters of the Indian state in Kashmir, and the other is that the displacement was created as machinations of the governor of Jammu and Kashmir at the time to discredit the movement for Azadi. So these are the larger two theories that come up, and this is, I don't engage with them in the sense that the truth is perhaps a lot more complicated than what either of those polarized views bring. And I think they've also caused more damage to understand the Kashmiri Pandit case. But I'll put it this way: that displacement of the Kashmiri Pandits represents it represents a problem in the context of Kashmir, because it suggests one point of break in relations between Hindus and Muslims of Kashmir. One of the important things about Kashmir is that, like Bengal and like Punjab, and even I think like Sindh as well, you're looking at an area where you have different religious groups, but there was a sense of identity that spoke to something beyond religion. To be Kashmiri was to be more than just a Hindu or a Muslim. The way there is a sense that there is a larger Bengali identity, there's a larger Punjabi identity, there's a larger sense of being Sindhi, right? And the tragedy of the partition, for example, is that the partition fractures those ways of being Bengali Punjabi, and Sindhi on the grounds of religion. Now, the Kashmiri Pandit exodus, in that sense, threatens a similar kind of fracturing on religious grounds. Relations between Pandits and Muslims have been fairly complex. I mean, many scholars have written about it. I mean, I've written a bit about it. I could think of work of scholars like Arthur Ziad Dipti Misri and Mona Ban who've tried to think about it. Nishita Thrissel and other scholars who've written about it. But whatever happened, that exodus, the departure of the Kashmiri Pandits, or the exodus, or the violence that happens to both sides, there's a violence both populations face. But that exodus or displacement, depending on what you want to call it, represents a kind of break in trust between two populations. And here, hence in 1990, you see a situation that is very similar to what one may have seen in the context of Punjab and Bengal, where until it seemed to be Bengali and Punjabi meant something, and then you have this partition. There are complex histories of religion, of course, in regions, but it seemed to override that larger sense of belonging to land. And this is something, and moments of mistrust. So what I would say when we read Dr. Kaul's account, who I write about, it is a complex story of being displaced. In South Asia, we lead lives overdetermined by the state, even if the state isn't really doing its job that well. I mean, that's one thing that unites South Asia. These are state apparatuses that you inherit from the British colonial state. But it is that moment of trust, I think, that comes up. And where trust is broken. And the challenge after that is, how does one fix that trust? Or how does one arrive at a position where we can repair some form of communication so we may communicate again? So, for example, I work at a university where we have students across South Asia. And I have students from India, Bangladesh, I had students from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and so on. And it is good to see, Indian Bengali students and Bangladeshi students getting along now, which I see in my classroom. Whereas in 1947, it was perhaps a very different story. But which also means that, unfortunately, trust between different communities takes a long time to heal. So I think that is an issue that comes up. And because it's something that takes a long time, that frustration remains at an immediate level. So I think that's one thing, if I get where you're going at. It's also this, we're always also looking for someone to blame for my plight. And I can be angry at the state, but given in conflict where then identities get extremely polarized, either intentionally or unintentionally, I might find my object of blame in someone else. But like I said, there is a moment of mistrust, but I've also seen a lot of tremendous work where people have attempted to repair that trust between Kashmiri Muslims and Pandits, and not in a kind of, we'll sit down and have a reconciliation meeting. No, I'm not talking about that. But people who've tried to talk about their histories, in the sense, which are different, because the history of displacement the Kashmiri Pandit has and the history of violence they have, in terms of the experience from 1990, is different from the history and experience of violence, say, the Kashmiri Muslim has living in Kashmir, which is an extremely militarized region. But we can still have a conversation. And we may try to understand the other's position. And there are endeavors like this I've come across. There's this wonderful website by two young journalists. I'm thinking of Akhilesh Nagari and Hanan Zafar. And two other associates of this worked on it. And I think they've done a fantastic job, much better than what any politician could do in that sense. But it is that question of trust. What do you do when you lose trust? And part of also the frustration of, say, people like this doctor was, if you're unemployed, you're tied to the state, you're supposed to work within the state. What kind of opportunities come up in terms of work, profession? These things matter, because displacement has also a major problem. You'll see this. You see this in a lot of counts of 1947, where when you're displaced and you're leaving your home behind, you're leaving your belongings behind, it leads to a dispossession. And your economic condition before displacement is often much better than what it is after displacement. So you spend a lot of energy recouping losses. And what if you can't recoup the loss? And where the question of basic survival comes up, even before ideology. And I think that becomes also a matter of frustration. in that sense. And displacement, whether it's refugees, internally displaced, and so on, it is a disruption to one's life and one's aspirations. So yeah.
Yeah, that's why I found this vignette very fascinating because it was a very universal human
Yeah.
example. You can look at
Yes.
the Pakistani state right now, you can look at Trump's America or Brexit
Yeah.
England. Wherever you look
Yeah.
in the world, you will see this sort of despair and frustration that is stemming from more material concerns.
Yeah.
And of course, the blame is laid on. But that's why I thought I should mention
Yeah.
it because it was so universal.
Yes. Yes.
Anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Datta, for coming and enlightening us, and thank you so much for your for shedding a light on these camps and these displaced people and showing us their stories.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please tune in next week for another amazing conversation with Dr. Madhumita Saha. The 1957 Partition Archive is hosting this series to commemorate 75 years of partition. This series is a daily micro podcast series being aired for 75 days between June 3rd and August 17th, except for Sundays, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of partition in 2022. For context, August 17th is the day the Boundary Commission announced the Radcliffe Line separating India and Pakistan, 75 days after the Partition Plan was announced on June 3rd, 1947. Thank you very much again.